This may seem like an unusual philosophical caveat to open a video with, but I'm opening this video by saying that if I use the word meaningful, and I'm going to use the word meaningful many, many times in this video, when I use the word meaningful here, I mean it in a very neutral, descriptive sense. I don't mean that something is good because it's meaningful, in the sense that many people might say a work of art is meaningful. It has very positive connotations. I'm going to talk about exclusion and my long history of being excluded from things, excluded from opportunities, for what I would call meaningful reasons. And it really does hurt me when people try to explain these experiences I've had, explain this big part of my life, by trying to reduce the situation to meaningless reasons, by trying to give reductionistic explanations for what's really happening here. So a couple of examples. I have the experience of being excluded from master's degree programs and PhD programs in Asian studies, academic study of politics and history of Asia. And it's for meaningful reasons. Now, why do I say meaningful? It's not because I'm ugly. It's not because I have low grades. It's not because of mere circumstances. It's not because I don't have enough money to, access Asian studies. It's not because of some personal defect of character on my part, akin to having a stutter. And I just say, I'm someone who's very well spoken. I can present myself very well at job interviews and in meetings and in high pressure situations. You guys may have noticed I do a lot of talking here on YouTube. And so I'm really especially aware of how people with a fairly minor defect of character, like having a stutter, just not being able to speak well and convincingly, I understand how that can impact their whole lives in these situations in a way that's meaningless. A lot of Cree people, you guys know I used to work with Cree and Ojibwe people when I lived in Saskatchewan. A lot of Cree people who have a traditional upbringing actually have mannerisms that really impede them this way. During a job interview or when asked a difficult question, being raised in their culture, they may respond to being asked a question by looking down at the floor and remaining silent for several seconds. I remember discussing this with a professor, that culturally this was taken as a sign that you were taking the question seriously and really thinking about it. But for most white Western English-speaking people, it seems dishonest and evasive. Why aren't you looking me in the eye? Why aren't you answering right away? This kind of thing. So there can be cultural barriers that also lead to people being excluded from opportunities in a way that's kind of meaningless. But Asian studies, for example, I have sent emails to and tried to apply to master's degrees and PhD programs in Asian studies, and I am often excluded because of how they define Asian studies. So I may write to a program and they write back to me. It's better when they say this openly and honestly. Sometimes I find out it more indirectly. And they say, well, their definition of Asian studies is just the study of literature and poetry, of a refined culture. In some cases, they write back and say that they also do cinema. In some cases, they maybe also do painting, the arts. Indeed, you can imagine just how much there is. The history of painting in China be a huge, huge topic. But for the most part, it's literature and poetry. And they write back and say, look, if you don't do classical literature and poetry of China, Japan, maybe there are a couple other places on the list, it's normally just China, Japan, then we aren't interested. We don't want to work with you. We don't want to supervise your research. So it is very, very hurtful to me when I explain to people what my situation is in academia and Asian studies, and they respond to that by trying to claim, no, there are plenty of opportunities for you in Asian studies. Your problem is just your character, that there's something abrasive or displeasing about you, like having a stutter. Oh, no, your problem is just how your resume is written, like how your CV is written. It's something relatively meaningless or trivial. Oh, no, you just need to apply again and change your behavior in some trivial way. That is really very hurtful to me. And, I ask myself this question sometimes. why am I on YouTube at all if I can't come on and talk about my feelings this way? I don't know what this video is going to mean for other people. I don't know what it would mean for my own daughter if she sees it someday. But I can tell you, this is really meaningful to me. And there's that word meaningful again. I think there's something here in human nature that gets touched on. Or maybe it's just in my nature in terms of my caring about honor and dignity and truth and justice. The point here is not to claim that I'm perfect and I'm blameless. And how dare you blame me for something that's somebody else's fault? Objectively speaking, it's not necessarily a fault at all that this academic discipline, Asian studies, defines what they do in the way that they do. But I'm telling you, look, my experience of being excluded, my negative experience, it's not meaningless and it's not trivial and it's not just me. It's not something about my mannerisms. And yeah, it is very, very hurtful for me to hear back that kind of comment. I really feel, how dare you? How dare you trivialize this? Something that's obviously has really serious long-term implications for me. And how dare you pin it on something you imagine about my character, just casting aspersions on me and disregarding what the context of this is, that not only explains, a huge part of my life and my struggle, but that also tells you something meaningful about the institutional and political context that we're all living in. So to end on that first example with Asian studies, what I'm asking you to understand, if you're one of the people I'm discussing this with, is not just, hey, look, it's not that I have low grades, it's not that I have a stutter, it's not that I'm personally abrasive in interviews with professors and putting them off this way. I want you to understand there are a lot of professors in academia who respond really negatively to my resume, my CV, because it has Buddhism in it. Some of them will respond and say, oh, we don't do Buddhist studies. That's a different department. Go to the Department of Religion. We just do Asian studies, and here's how we define that. There are people who respond negatively to the fact that politics is in my CV, is in my resume. And they say, oh, we don't do politics. We just do literature and poetry. There's another department. Go to the politics department. Don't talk to us. So again, whether this is objectively good or this is objectively bad is another issue. But hey, Matt, here's a huge one. I'm an anti-communist. I'm pro-democracy and anti-communism. And there are professors of Asian studies, there are professors of Chinese studies and the history of China who are members of the Communist Party, who are sincerely pro-communist. And some of those people are born and raised Chinese or ethnically Chinese. And some of them are white people who converted to Chinese communism, became supporters of Chinese communism. And I'm very familiar with that because my own parents were both white people who converted to Chinese communism, who became supporters of Mao Zedong and of communist extremism in general in their case. They also supported Joseph Stalin. That's kind of a story for another video. So look, the next two examples I now think I can run through pretty briefly in parallel to this, and this is why I was so upset by comments recently made by this guy named David here on YouTube and on Patreon. I understand why I've been excluded from opportunities in Buddhism. And this came up in a video that was kind of upsetting and interesting to me. I put up a video of my speaking to a professor of Buddhist studies. And it was a really lousy University Department of Buddhist Studies offering a master's degree and PhD. And it's a video you can see here on YouTube, my talking to this professor. And right at the beginning, he says, look, why would you want this opportunity? Like, our university is so humble. Are you sure you'd really want to do this? This will be kind of terrible for your career and probably you won't learn very much being here and so on. And, the point at which that conversation really turns sour, because it's quite positive and communicative and collaborative up to a point, is when I start talking about bias or prejudice within Buddhist studies, which is a very real thing, and that a lot of this bias and prejudice is against me. And then he immediately becomes very hostile and very defensive, as if I'm accusing him of being a racist or something. And the conversation falls apart and it ends acrimoniously. So this doesn't just run parallel to the example I'm giving you. It's both parallel and intersects with this issue, because this is an example of it. what I was trying to explain to him is, look, I'm excluded from some departments of Buddhist studies because they're run by people who are devoted to Tibet, Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan politics, Tibetan history, Tibetan language. And I understand that. Like, I understand I'm being excluded for a reason. There are other departments, academic departments for Buddhist studies, where everyone is devoted to Sanskrit as a language, and then to some extent the history and politics of India, etc. And I'm excluded from that. There are many departments of Buddhist studies that are primarily rooted in Japanese Buddhism, and Japanese as a language, and Japanese politics. So again, the point is, look, this is a meaningful reason why I'm being excluded. This is a meaningful reason why I don't have these opportunities. That doesn't mean it's good. That doesn't mean I agree with it. But I can sympathize. If I'm a professor in this department, if I'm a professor in the university, and I've devoted my whole life to Japanese as a language, I've devoted my whole life to Tibetan or Sanskrit or any of these examples, I can understand why they would receive a CV, they would receive a resume, they would receive an application from someone like me, and they would say, look, this guy has expertise in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Yunnan. We don't want him. This guy has expertise in an area where we don't have expertise, where we don't want to be challenged, we don't want to think about these things. And of course, it's not just political, it's not just linguistic. There's also religion involved. There's also deeply held personal beliefs. They don't want their beliefs challenged. But even if language were the only issue, you must understand Cambodian is a completely alien language from Japanese. Pali is a completely alien language from Tibetan, so on and so forth. So I can understand why I'm being excluded for those reasons. And it really hurts me to have people say, no, this is just your fault. This is just some defective character you have, etc. So my reason for making this video now is that I just had this interaction with a guy named David. And he was writing to me and suggesting that I was being excluded from participating in other vegan political groups, other vegan organizations and movements for a pretty meaningless reason or set of reasons. He was suggesting that I was being excluded because the email I was writing to these people, the emails I was sending, were just not very good at introducing me or presenting my channel, presenting what I had to offer. Anyway, in reply at first, I gave him an example of the actual emails that I do offer. And, I found his reply to that also quite hurtful in exactly this way. I'm excluded from participating in most vegan groups for meaningful reasons. So I'm, give an example, I'm a critic of animal sanctuaries. Several videos, you search the word sanctuary on this channel. I talk about how much money and how much time and how much effort goes into keeping just one horse alive on a sanctuary. You can devote your whole life and all your fundraising to just keeping one horse alive in a sanctuary, and you have to shovel the horse's poo, and you have to provide it with at least a monthly visit from a vet and deworming services and so on and so forth. And the outcome of this, if you manage to keep a couple of horses and a couple of pigs, is ultimately not very different from these animals being on a farm. It's just a farm that goes on forever and ever, as opposed to a farm that slaughters them. It's a farm that continues until they die of relatively natural causes. But this isn't even morally equivalent to a zoo, and it's not equivalent to habitat conservation or putting these animals in a context where they can live a natural life, where they can live a feral life, where they can reproduce and hunt and forage and find their own food. It is still keeping them in captivity. It's keeping them in farm-like conditions. It's just a farm that operates at a loss rather than for a profit. Now, even if that were the only ethical issue and the only political issue that alienates me from other vegan groups, it's a meaningful issue. It explains why they don't want to work with me, and in many cases, why I don't want to work with them. So yeah, it is uniquely and deeply hurtful to me for me to hear back from other vegans like, oh no, there are plenty of opportunities for you in veganism. There are plenty of organizations or institutions you could work with. There are plenty of vegan activists you could work with. You've just somehow got some trivial foible. You've got something about you like a stutter that somehow is abrasive or rubs people the wrong way, that it's somehow just petty circumstances that have resulted in you not being able to cooperate with these people productively. No. I think there are real reasons and meaningful reasons why I'm not a member of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, why I'm not a member of DXE, Direct Action Everywhere, why I'm not a member of any of these other institutions. And yes, in many cases, I exclude them. I mean, this is also true. It's not even being mentioned of the academic situation, the first two examples. There are many cases where I'm turning them down, where I'm excluding them, and there are many cases where they're excluding me. And for me at least, maybe there's a broader moral to this story. Some of you guys can draw, whether you're dealing with personal, professional, educational, career aspirations, or political aspirations and humanitarian aspirations. I think it's really significant. Let's treat what's meaningful as meaningful, and let's have the maturity and detachment to treat what's meaningless as meaningless.